Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. Work collaboration tools can be a fantastic way to get things done and drive results within teams. They also offer more than just efficiency. With today's technology, you can gain insights, data, and information that HR and business leaders often only dream of. This can happen with a variety of technology, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, which can be used to better understand how our employees get their best work done and really feel about working at your organization. On this episode of the Workology Podcast, we're talking about collaborative technology and the data and insights from it that can help give your organization a real competitive advantage. Today I'm joined by Jason Morgan. Jason is the Vice President of Behavioral Intelligence at Wiretap. He holds his PhD in political methodology from The Ohio State University, where he retains a visiting scholar position. Jason, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. Tell us about maybe your PhD and how you got to Wiretap.
Yeah, sure, of course. As you mentioned, I have a PhD from Ohio State University in political methodology. So during my time there, I was really focused on the statistical analysis of social network types of data. And then after I finished my PhD in 2015, I did a one-year postdoc also at Ohio State. And then I became a data scientist at Nationwide Insurance, where I worked on things like optimizing the online sales funnel and designing experiments and a little bit of computer vision work, just basically the things that the data scientists in a large organization usually do. But for that whole time, my real passion has always been working with social network data. So after a year at Nationwide, when Wiretap called, I jumped at the chance to move over here and work on our Aware platform.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit about what collaborative technology is. Maybe for someone who isn't familiar with this type of tech and how it might be used at work.
Oh, sure. So examples of collaboration platforms, they include things like Slack, Workplace by Facebook, Yammer, and Teams by Microsoft. And these technologies are often seen as being somewhat different than email in that they allow real-time conversations and collaboration through conversations or through threaded conversations, free-flowing chat, as well as organizational level announcements and that type of thing. So these technologies are often deployed with the intent to really break down silos and allow people within a large organization to communicate. And as I said, they allow people to communicate in real time, which can help increase productivity by allowing free flow of information and eliminate some of the organizational barriers that are always in place and always exist in large organizations.
You and Wiretap have done some really interesting and exciting research that looks at the perks and perils of collaborative technology platforms. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more interesting findings?
The perks that we really see in these is what I alluded to before, being that the collaboration through these technologies, collaboration can be facilitated across an organization. It breaks down silos, allows people to communicate across geographic regions. They can really help, or these collaboration platforms can really help employees develop relationships across an organization that wouldn't be possible maybe because they work in completely different areas, time zones, or just within different organizational groups. It really allows people to develop relationships with people outside of their usual circle of colleagues. But on the other hand, you're right, there are some perils. It comes from the fact that these collaboration platforms support real-time collaboration, free-flowing communication, conversations, which really tend to be more casual, often more candid than the normal types of conversations around the water cooler or within meetings. And so it's because of this, when people speak in private chat that other, leadership may not know anything about, this is what sometimes makes leadership a little bit wary of things like Workplace by Facebook or Yammer. Our research has really shown that these perils or these potential perils can really be transformed into value for enterprises. I mean, we found that leaders can leverage communication data in these platforms to really understand how employees are feeling and operating in real time. And this is one of the reasons that we have built our flagship product, Aware. So Aware integrates into these enterprise collaboration platforms, such as Workplace and Teams and Yammer, to give organizations a machine learning or AI-infused glimpse into how employees are behaving on their networks, while also providing data governance and compliance and security solutions. And it's really the employee behavioral insights that has inspired the research that my team and I have been doing, particularly with regards to organizational sentiment of communications.
I think this is fascinating, and I know that every HR leader and business leader, for that matter, your executive team, is always looking for insights and an understanding of what is happening in the organization, what's the pulse of the employee population, and your guys' technology helps provide them that information also in real time. So it's the public information, but also the private information, and sometimes it sounds like that information is vastly different. The things that are shared, maybe the sentiment of that in those private messaging opportunities. But I want to talk a little bit more about sentiment for maybe somebody who's not familiar about what that is. Can you kind of walk us through what sentiment is and how that might work?
Oh, sure. So sentiment is, as it's related to, a work environment, is really just a measurement of the mood or the feeling of employees toward the company, towards the company culture, or towards leadership. And at Wiretap, we think it's incredibly important because if a company or a leader can drill down into specific business units or work groups, they can identify potential problems. I mean, if they identify negative sentiment within some group, they can really maybe drill down into where these types of negative sentiment may be affecting the entire company, or even actually whether they can find stellar groups within the company that have very high performing, maybe they're a high performing group, but they also are associated with very high sentiment. So these groups can be role models for the rest of the company. So not only have we developed a metric that can be used, a sentiment metric that can be used at multiple levels of an organization, we've also worked on another aspect of communications, and that's what we call a toxicity metric. And this metric is a measurement of, some distracting, behaviors that have the potential to make people at work feel maybe unsafe or isolated or harassed. And this can include things like unprofessional behavior, like swearing, general harassment, or even discriminatory types of communications. And so examples of a toxicity messages a toxic message might contain, racial or religious or sexual slurs, sexual innuendo, or harsh languages. So these are the two types of aspects of language we are currently looking at.
Why do you think there's a difference between the sentiment and toxicity between the private versus public messaging? Which one is in your real opinion, is that, or the position of that employee?
Yeah, well, it's absolutely true. I mean, people in private communications are going to be much more candid than they're likely to be in a public communication. And that's just kind of a fact of life. But it's really, I need to emphasize, after talking about negative sentiment and toxicity after the last question, I need to emphasize that most messages, the vast majority of messages within an organization, have a neutral sentiment. They're neither positive or negative. They're just people trying to get their jobs done. And they also are not toxic at all. Toxic messages are very rare. But when a leader does deploy one of these collaboration platforms, they need to keep in mind that, as our research shows, that 2 out of every 13 individuals in an organization only communicate on these platforms through private communications. So if a leader is really wanting to understand how their company feels, you must get a gauge of the sentiment, toxicity, just the mood of the company or the mood of these conversations through private communication. And furthermore, 2.5 or a private message, according to our research, is 2.5 times more likely to be negative in sentiment. And in one-on-one conversations that are private, they're also 2.5 times more likely to contain some kind of what we consider toxic speech. Most of the time that is just innuendo or kind of harsh language. But every once in a while we do run across cases where our customers have found instances of harassment and other things that you really just want to get off of your corporate network and be aware of.
I think about this just like I would in an in-person meeting. If you have a large group, maybe you're doing a company meeting or monthly communication with the executive team, or even a roundtable with a group of leaders, those conversations, when it is public versus a one-on-one conversation, are oftentimes different. And I think most HR professionals that are listening to this podcast can think the difference between maybe a focus group meeting versus a one-on-one. Sometimes that's when the truth really comes out. And it sounds like that these online collaboration tools and communication platforms follow kind of the same rule of thumb that we've kind of made assumptions when it comes to in-person communication.
Yes, I agree completely. And that is what our research does show.
Let's take a bit of a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast, sponsored by Clear Company, and we're talking today about collaborative technology. Today we're talking with Jason Morgan with Wiretap. You can follow Jason on Twitter at Jason_W_Morgan. That's MORGAN.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company. Clear Company is the world's fastest growing talent management platform, allowing companies to easily hire, retain, and engage more A players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free demo.
You and your colleagues, Jason, dove into some research, which we've just been discussing, that looks at business topics and also conversations that have happened on these collaborative platforms. Sometimes it seems like our work platforms and our social media, frankly, is always inundated with cat memes and GIFs, rather than maybe focusing on the business at hand. Sometimes I personally have found that these personal interactions, the memes and just kind of fun, casual conversations, actually strengthen business relationships and help get work done. Do you have any thoughts or are considering research in this area that might support or dispute my kind of basic assumptions here?
Well, first off, yeah, as we all know, there are a lot of cat memes and GIFs that float around on social media, and that includes within these collaboration platforms. However, I think, as I believe I mentioned at the outset, these platforms, and as you mentioned, these platforms and even these types of very informal conversations, candid conversations, or cat memes can really help develop relationships between people across a company. And so it really does help facilitate work when work needs to get done. So I would not, to a leader who's worried about cat memes, I would tell them that this is not something you should really be concerned about. That said, we are looking now to move our Aware platform and the behavioral insights that we do provide to start looking at and understanding if we can look at communications between people and identify, top performers, understand which groups, if we can associate different forms of communication with high-performing groups versus low-performing groups, if we can identify situations in a company where there's potential, for a lack of communication between groups, ultimately we hope that our findings and that our modeling of social network interactions can help inform organizational structural or changes in structure and policies that could help improve productivity and really workplace culture in our customers' networks.
Again, I like to think about in-person interaction and maybe how this collaborative technology sort of mirrors or is parallel to that. And I think about golf outings with the executive leadership team, or you have an activity, maybe it's a team building activity that you do with your group. And for online, team building might be cat memes and GIFs. So it's important, though, to measure, and what your technology does, which I think is really cool, is you can measure the effectiveness of the team and then really understand those interactions online that are happening and try to maybe model or share or train other teams to maybe look at some different behaviors to improve their collaboration or how they work together.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of the key aspects that people need to understand about these platforms is, as I mentioned at the beginning, that they are real-time. These are real-time collaboration platforms. And for that reason, we really believe you need to have a real-time insight view into how people are communicating. And for example, if you do, it's common in large organizations for them to do a once yearly Gallup survey to get a gauge of, to gauge the feeling or even the sentiment of their employees. These are really weak, or this is a weak signal about how people feel towards a company, because they just take a snapshot of sentiment at one point in time. And so you can imagine that if there is a positive event that occurs at a company, maybe it's a cultural event, team building types of exercise, that if you administer the Gallup survey immediately following this type of event, you're going to get a higher level of engagement or positive sentiment towards the company than you would if you administered the survey after a negative event, such as mass layoff or something else, or negative or poorly performing quarterly report or something like that. So what's really important is that when you deploy and you use these collaboration platforms, that you get an insight into how your people or how your employees are communicating in real time, that really mirrors how these platforms actually work.
I think there's a lot of value in the work that you guys are doing, and I can think of the data that you would have available when a layoff happens, or a lot of turnover in a department, or something impacting maybe a certain geographic area or a community. I think about like natural disasters, right? So if there was a tornado or the floods that were in New Orleans that impacted a large group of people recently, you can monitor how they're really feeling, the kinds of conversations that are happening, the sentiment or the toxicity, and then make a informed business decision about how to help give them the support that they need in order to be successful. And I think that's what is really most important and interesting about what you guys are doing.
Yes, and a lot of this is somewhat from our vantage point. This is future work. We really, as I mentioned, hope to drill into see how people communicate and associate that, we hope, with positive and negatively performing groups or organizations. But with our platform right now, because companies possess, their performance indicators, they can gauge in real time right now, how people are communicating, how they're feeling, are they having a positive or a negative sentiment associated with different policy changes that the company themselves already know about it. So the HR leaders will know that an event occurred, maybe a flood or maybe something else, and they will know then and be able to associate that possibly with, a gauge of the sentiment of communications across the collaboration platforms in real time.
Well, Jason, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people go to connect with you and learn about the work at Wiretap and what you're doing?
Oh, sure. So the best place to find out about our Aware platform is at wiretap.com. And you can always follow me and some of the work my team and I are doing at my Twitter account, which is at Jason_W_Morgan.
We'll also link to Jason's LinkedIn and include a copy of the report that Wiretap just released that talks more about the research and information that he has uncovered. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jessica.
The research and work that Jason and his team at Wiretap are doing is truly amazing. Data is such an important part of where I believe modern HR is moving towards. Analytics and information obtained through technology that incorporates machine learning and artificial intelligence helps to elevate our efforts in how we engage, train, retain, and work with our employees. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller-Merrill. Until next time, visit Workology to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Are you stuck maintaining your HRCI and SHRM certifications? Learn by Workology is an on-demand learning system making recertification simple. Visit workology.com/learn or text Workology to 55678 to learn more. Text 55678 to Workology. Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller-Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.